Are you taking the wrong college admissions test? Once upon a time, the SAT dominated the landscape of college admissions testing. But over the last few years, that dominance has drastically changed. Students have been really unhappy with the SAT for a while now, and that's caused them to completely overhaul the way that they do this test, going to the brand new and controversial adaptive digital format. How do students feel about the SAT now? And how does the ACT fit into all of this? And which test should you take? We're going to dive into all of these topics here in today's video. I'm Carson Weekley, and I've coached thousands of students on both the ACT and the SAT. I've studied both of these tests, and I've seen the trends and changes on both of them over time. So in order to understand these tests, we first have to start off with the background of the SAT. So this test was created by the College Board way back in 1926, almost 100 years ago now, as kind of like an IQ test that was used to assess college readiness. And originally, the SAT was just used by a couple of small elite colleges to assess the best high school students. But throughout the 1900s, as college became more standardized and as more students just started naturally going to college as the next step after high school, the SAT took over and completely dominated the high school testing landscape. However, around 1960, a college professor created the ACT as a way to compete with the SAT's IQ test. The ACT started out as kind of a regional test that was only taken in the Midwest and in the South, while the SAT completely dominated everywhere else. But colleges quickly saw equal value in both the ACT and the SAT, and they started treating these tests as completely interchangeable with one another. In fact, nowadays, most colleges will actually convert either test into their own scaled score, and a lot of times admissions officers won't even know which test a student took when they're looking at admitting that student to college. Understanding all this background is important as we look into how and why this tests ended up where they are today, and when we're looking at which test is better for you to take. So once schools began looking at these tests as complete equals, the SAT actually started losing its dominance. Students had always just defaulted to taking the SAT since it was the more well-known, more popular test at the time. But on the other hand, the ACT had some of its own advantages. The SAT was always trying to maintain its IQ-like testing roots. So they would continually introduce new and more complicated types of questions and really make the test as difficult to prepare for as possible. They did this by using fancy and unfamiliar vocab words in all of their problems. And they asked a lot of questions about really old English and Shakespeare style of writing that's difficult for students to understand. And these types of questions are not only difficult to understand, but they're tough to prepare for unless you grew up reading Old English and understanding Shakespeare's style of writing. So with the SAT, some students naturally did very well, but the ones who didn't ended up having a much tougher time improving their scores. Meanwhile, the ACT, on the other hand, had a different approach to testing. They certainly still want to trick students, but they do this more with asking longer, complicated questions and giving students a lot less time for each section of the test. This meant that students could learn the content and create strategies to approach each section, allowing them to improve their scores more consistently. This is different from the SAT, where you kind of either just do well or you don't, and there's not much ability to actually improve. So after complete dominance over college admissions tests for many years, in the 2010s, the ACT actually passed the SAT in terms of popularity in the United States. And obviously, the company behind the SAT is not happy about this. They tried a number of different things to hold on to their market share before the ACT surpassed them. And after the ACT surpassed them, they've still tried a number of different things to bring themselves back to their original dominance. Back in 2005, when the SAT saw that it was losing its dominance, they completely overhauled their test, going from a 1,600 point scale to a 2,400 point scale. But this change didn't make any difference. The ACT still became the more popular test in the 2010s. So in 2016, the SAT actually reverted back from their 2,400 scale to their 1,600 point scale. But neither of these overhauls seem to work as they've continued to just slowly lose market share to the ACT over time. And now in 2024, as I'm sure we've all heard, the SAT is trying something completely different again, going to a new online format and making the test adaptive, where the test actually gets harder if you answer more questions right, and it gets easier if you get more questions wrong. The trade-off here is that if you see these easier questions instead of the harder questions, your score is actually going to be capped at a lower level, so you're not going to be able to get a high score if you see the easy questions. And the company behind the SAT is marketing this new test as an easier, more student-friendly, shorter test since it adapts to your knowledge level. But is this really a better test for students, or is it just a marketing ploy to bring more money to the company behind the SAT? Since you still have to get the hard questions correct in order to get a good score, there's really no reason why the adaptive changes are beneficial to students. And the more important change that took place is that the SAT actually got rid of a lot of its practice material that helped students get ready for this test. And that's with the SAT already being the more difficult test to improve on. After the first US digital test in March, which was just a few weeks ago as of this recording, a ton of students and parents were completely outraged at how difficult this test was, especially when compared to the practice materials that the SAT had given for students to use. If the SAT is going to make their actual test questions really difficult, then they should also make their practice questions just as difficult, is what a lot of students and parents are saying. So now, students and parents have a decision to make. Should they take the SAT or should they take the ACT? And here's the best answer for you. If you think that you're great at understanding really complicated questions in Old English, and you have a really strong, broad vocabulary understanding, as well as a very sound understanding of all of the math concepts taught in high school, then the SAT might actually be a better test for you. If this sounds like you, then what you can do is just take the SAT one time to see how you do, or you could look at your PSAT scores, since most high schools mandate that test in both 10th and 11th grade anyways. And if this initial score seems like a great score for you, then that's probably just all you need to do for standardized testing. But if you're not satisfied with these initial scores, or if this description of the test just doesn't sound like it fits you that well, then the ACT is probably the better choice for you. With the ACT, you can start early on and become really familiar with the concepts and the structure of the test. Because they haven't significantly changed the test since all the way back in 1989, it's not a complete surprise as to what is going to be on the next test. You can prepare for the types of questions they're going to ask, and you can come up with good strategies to approach each section of the test, leaving you with consistent and reliable score improvement over time. And the good thing is, whether you think you can do well on the SAT or not, everybody can make good score improvement on the ACT. So if you're confused about which test you should take, it's probably a safer bet to prepare for and take the ACT. Again, this is all from somebody who has coached a ton of students on both of these tests for a number of years. I always want the best outcomes for my students, so if the SAT at some point in the future becomes the better option for most students, then I will completely go full steam ahead on recommending the SAT for my students. But as of right now, in April of 2024, I have to lean more towards the ACT as a more consistent and reliable way for students to improve, especially if you're looking to make significant score improvement from wherever you start out. If you're interested in seeing what it looks like to work with an expert on improving and maxing out your ACT score, I've put together a case study on how one of my students took her ACT score from a 22 all the way up to a 30 in just 6 weeks of focused preparation. You can check that out at the link in the description. And if you're interested in working with me personally, you can apply to our program on that page as well. And for everybody else, stay tuned to the channel where I'll continue keeping you updated on all of the trends in college admissions. See you in the next one.